Good morning. Thanks everybody for taking the time to be with us today. And thank you very much for doing education reporting in the Commonwealth. It's very important and we're grateful for your attention. And we're talking to you today on behalf of the entire PA Schools Work campaign. And also in general, we think that we're sort of entering a new stage as the Basic Education Funding Commission begins its hearings next week. And we wanted to make sure that we shared our view of the context of these hearings with you and some specifics of what we hope that the Basic Education Funding Commission will accomplish. We don't need to explain to you the implications of the lawsuit that was won in February and which the parties in the lawsuit agreed not to appeal the judge's decision that says that the Commonwealth must find a way to direct its resources more appropriately, or as we would say per the Constitution, in a thorough and efficient manner to every school district in the Commonwealth so that every child has equal opportunity to a quality education. And we're very grateful that the parties have not appealed this ruling and are ready to get to work in the Basic Education Funding Commission to find a solution to the, or as we would call it in legal parlance, a remedy to the conclusions that the judge put forward in the lawsuit and that she'll be expecting to hear from the legislature and the governor's office about. The venue of the Basic Education Funding Commission is not new. For those of you who were reporting on these issues in 2014, you'll remember there was a Basic Education Funding Commission that was established in the Wolf administration. And the purpose of that commission was to establish a school funding formula, because the predecessor governor, Tom Corbett, had blacklined out of the school code any reference to a school funding formula, and schools were just getting modest increases based on prior year allocation. And that Basic Education Funding Commission was made up of House and Senate, Democrats and Republicans, and the governor's office. And they did an extraordinary job in coming up with a formula. And I have to say, having spent 25 years in school funding wonkland, it's an extraordinarily powerful formula. It effectively directs funds to the school districts who have students that come to school with the greatest needs most. And so they are kids who are coming from households of low income, children who aren't speaking English. And it also accommodates the implications of the disparity in our local tax bases. Communities that are higher wealth and have don't need to tax themselves so high to generate plenty of money for their schools, or enough money, probably nobody would say plenty, can do so. And the formula then directs more state aid to school districts that, like Greater Johnstown, no matter how high they tax themselves, they can't generate enough from their property tax base to support their schools. So it's a really, really good formula, and it was very hard work. And it was work done in a bipartisan manner and extraordinary leadership of the prior governor and his staff to forge an agreement that gives Pennsylvania one of the best school funding formulas in the country. But as you know, that formula only applies to new money appropriated from 2016 forward. And so it applies to far less than 20% of the $7 billion that is currently being distributed to Pennsylvania schools. And as such, the result is, as was explained in the lawsuit, many school districts are underfunded. And I failed to mention that the formula also applies to an accurate student count. So school districts are getting paid actually on the number of students who are attending, which sounds common sense. But from 1991 to 2015, school districts were being paid on the number of students that were educating kids in those districts way back in 1991. But I digress. Accurate student count is an important piece of this. So one of the things to keep in mind is this is our third effort in the Commonwealth to, since 91, put a formula in place that gets money to the districts that need it the most. In 2007, the Rendell administration forged an agreement with the House Republicans and the Senate Republicans to establish a new school funding formula and put adequacy targets in place that said districts that were farthest from what was needed would get more money first than districts that had more sufficient funds, and also do that in relationship to their local tax effort. Democrats and Republicans working together, strong leadership from the governor's office. 2015, Democrats, Republicans working together, strong leadership from the governor's office, gets us a new funding formula. And the flaw in that is it only applied to new money. So here we are again. We have a chance to solve for that flaw and a chance to solve for the lawsuit in the new Basic Education Funding Commission's work. And it is, again, Democrats and Republicans coming together. It is a solution that will benefit, the solution that's needed will benefit communities that are represented by Republicans and Democrats. And here we have a great governor who can forge the pathway to reaching that bipartisan agreement. You know, when I think about the basic education funding formula, I think about, it sounds impossible. How do you create a formula that's really going to direct money to what might be a minority, 200, 220 districts that are the least far from what they need? Well, there's 500 districts across the state, and they're represented by Republicans and Democrats that will not necessarily always benefit the same. It sounds hard. The math sounds really hard politically. But there was something hard that Governor Shapiro just accomplished, and that was the rebuilding of I-95. When that bridge collapsed, living here in Philadelphia, I can tell you, we all thought I-95 was going to be closed for months. A typical road project just to get a pothole repaired on 95 can take months. But what happened is the governor brought together the federal government, the state government, the local government, and he built an extraordinary sense of ambition and a commitment to saying, we're not going to let this highway collapse or wreck our economy. We are going to get this done as fast as possible, and we are going to put aside petty disagreements and find a solution. And in a matter of weeks, I-95 was operating, and America's trucks and passengers had a pathway to get what they needed done. And that's the same ambition that we know this governor and this legislature can apply to the Basic Education Funding Commission. It can work together. The governor can lead the way, and it can create the kind of opportunity, of economic opportunity and social opportunity for children in the Commonwealth that I-95 offers every day to the commerce of this nation and the work of this nation. So we're very excited about what's ahead over the next several weeks of hearings. And we're very ambitious about the work that can be done. And we're very excited about the opportunity to inform the commission and make sure that they tackle the really root challenges that we skirted in the last commission. Although it's great work on the formula, it didn't quite finish the job. This one can do that. And Susan Spicka is going to walk through what that means when we say how we can inform them and what we need them to get done. And then we'll come back for questions.
So we're going to start with a quick clip of a video of Governor Shapiro from his first budget address, and then we will go into the nitty-gritty about what we need to see from the Basic Education Funding Commission.
Our kids need help. We need to hear them, and I think we need to act right now. I spoke a lot about building safe and strong communities, the foundation of which is an adequate and equitable public education system. Last month, President Judge Renee Cohn-Jubileer of the Commonwealth Court issued a ruling declaring Pennsylvania's system for funding public education unconstitutional. That ruling was a call to action, literally a call to action, because her remedy, in her opinion, was for us to get around the table and come up with a solution that ensures every child has access to a thorough and efficient education. While there's still time left to file an appeal, all indications are that Judge Jubileer's ruling will stand. And that means that we are all acknowledging that this court has ordered us to come to the table and come up with a better system, one that passes constitutional muster. I want you to know that I am ready to meet you there.
So this, Governor Shapiro refers many times to coming to the table. And this Basic Education Funding Commission that is going to start meeting next week is that table. So the deadline for the appeal has passed and the ruling is final. So it is just time to look forward. As we've said, the Basic Education Funding Commission is the vehicle that has been designated as the way to address the lawsuit. So we had a 1 year where Governor Shapiro had his first budget. Everybody's kind of been, getting used to Harrisburg, and this is the year that this work needs to happen. So the Basic Education Funding Commission was previously created by the PA law, and it was charged with reviewing the basic education funding formula. But as we look forward, its scope needs to be much broader, given the moment that we are in right now with needing to have a remedy for the school funding lawsuit. And I think it's important for all of us to just reflect on the moment where we are in Pennsylvania right now, where we have this once in a generation opportunity to reform the unconstitutional funding system. We cannot afford for this moment to be wasted. It is really time for lawmakers in Harrisburg to get to work on this. And so when we talk about it being the table, we have 4 different requirements that we need to see come out of the Basic Education Funding Commission. And I think it's really important to ground this in understanding that what we're asking for is the norm. This is what we should have been seeing in Pennsylvania. This is what should have already happened. But now we have gotten to the moment where this needs to happen in order for us to have a constitutional school funding system. So the first thing that we need to have are adequacy targets for all 500 school districts. So if anybody watched the lawsuit, it was very clear that there were defined actual dollar amounts that were determined that were necessary for students to have the resources that they need in their school districts. The idea that we would go forward after the Basic Education Funding Commission and not have a target for each school district and not have a measurable way to determine whether or not students have the resources, the Basic Education Funding Commission would be a failure if it does not determine these. So we need to make sure that we are basing funding on what's needed to provide as Judge Jubileer said, the comprehensive, effective, and contemporary education. We can't say this is what we've always done, or this is just the money that we have now, so we're just going to move forward doing what we've always done. These adequacy targets that we're asking for, one for each school district, they set the goals for funding levels that are based on student needs and that are based on the spending levels of districts that have good performance. The legislature already has a method for calculating these targets, and they've recently been updated. So this is not reinventing the wheel. This is simply establishing this as what comes out of the Basic Education Funding Commission. Next, we need to make sure that this is not just about basic education funding, but it also needs to include other very important funding streams that are obviously very critical and that were really incredibly big parts of the school funding lawsuit, which include pre-K, special education, facilities, and transportation. So, the court found, for all of you that probably watched the lawsuit, that low-wealth school districts were shortchanged in these areas, and that these different areas are really what contribute to an adequate and equitable education for all students. So we need the Basic Education Funding Commission to go beyond looking narrowly at basic education funding and to look at incorporating these factors as well. So the Basic Education Funding Commission really needs to estimate the cost of providing these resources and incorporate them into the overall funding targets that they set at the end of in their final report. Another issue that we have that Donna brought up is the issue of local effort and local share. Some districts, as we saw in the school funding lawsuit, have such low property wealth that no matter how high they tax themselves, they simply cannot raise the money at the local level. And so we really need this Basic Education Funding Commission to determine a fair share of state funding for districts that are going to be unable to close these adequacy gaps with local revenue themselves. So we are looking for the Basic Education Funding Commission to set state share targets as part of their final report. And then finally, we need this Basic Education Funding Commission to lay out a reasonable timeline. This is not a moment when they can kick the can down the road and just say well, we'll work on this in the future. We need a timeline. We need the adequacy targets, and we need a timeline for how the state is going to close its share of the adequacy gap to implement this funding formula. This timeline that is laid out should be no longer than 3 to 5 years. Kids have been waiting for decades already. And this plan has to include inflationary increases for future years, because if this gets set in stone and there are no inflationary increases, then we're going to end up in a similar issue, facing similar issues moving forward. So there is a timetable that we have. So the Basic Education Funding Commission begins its public hearings next week on the 12th. Those run through November 9th. Their report is due on November 30th. So, this work can and should be done this fall. Governor Shapiro has his budget proposal on February 6th, and then we also know that the state budget is done on June 30th. So, as Donna said, we have a governor who knows how to get things done. It is now time for lawmakers in Harrisburg to focus their time and energy on getting this work done for a constitutional school funding system in Pennsylvania. And this is a very reasonable timeline if they put their effort and energy into doing that work. So I am going to now turn it back to Donna. Oop, you're still on mute.
I will thank you so much. I will mention to reporters that in the 2006 formula work, the costing out study was done in 2006, and the legislature enacted the results of that costing out study in 2007 and established a time frame, much as we're proposing here, that would over 6 years ensure that the Commonwealth put the $2.6 billion that study had found was needed created a multi-year rolled out time frame. So none of this is rocket science. None of this takes months of research. This is a very reasonable timeline, and this legislature has done it before in a bipartisan fashion. So with that, we're really eager to hear your questions. So fire away.
Thanks, Donna, and thanks, Susan. So a reminder, you can either click the raise your hand button or you can type the question in the Q&A dialog box at the bottom of the screen on your Zoom dashboard. Let's see, Wade, I'm going to click the unmute button. Hopefully we'll be able to hear you.
Hello, can you hear me all right?
Yes, we
Yeah.
can. Go ahead, Wade. Thanks.
Awesome. So we've heard a lot about sort of the amount of funding that is adequate enough for these schools. Not so much, unless I'm missing, sort of the structure of how these schools will receive the funding. Are there any expenses associated with, setting up a fund for these to receive these federal money? Any sort of things related to that? You mentioned the I-95. It seems easier to fix a road when there was, a road there before, if that makes sense.
So a couple of things. Really good question. First of all, we're talking about all state funds right now. And the numbers that have been shared by Matt Kelly in the litigation point to a $4.6 billion shortfall, but those numbers have been updated recently. And so I would call your attention to the release of the new data that Matt Kelly will share at the first Basic Education Funding Commission meeting. And that will establish a total figure, and some share of that will be paid for by school districts and taxpayers directly because they have the ability or capacity to do so. And some share of that, as Susan said, will be decided by the Basic Ed Commission to be from the state. Assuming that you're rolling it out, the funds, let's pretend the state has to come up with $3 billion. And over 5 years, they're putting $3 billion into schools. Schools currently receive their money in the state budget in line items like the basic education line item, the special education line item, there's a pre-K line item, there's a facilities line item. So they have already pathways for the allocation, and we have formulas that decide already the allocations of those funds. So what you would be doing, for instance, in a school district like Norristown, is they would be shifting from perhaps $11,000 a student that's available to them now, and over a 6-year period across all those line items, let's assume they're at $18,000. And that's going to enable Norristown then to hire sufficient number of teachers to competitively offer a teacher salary with a suburban school district. So reduce class size, great teachers, upgrade their facilities, upgrade their books, begin to offer AP courses. So school districts who have been operating without resources, they know what they need to spend the money on. Now, I will say in 2007, when the funding formula was started to be rolled out, the legislature did identify 11 uses for those funds. Most of them I just said, 11 uses for those funds where school districts, after the rate of inflation, so let's say a year of inflation of 3%, if their state increase was above 3%, then the funds would be used for the kinds of things I just said, which are proven to boost student performance. This legislature could come up with a new list of those things. But again, when you listen in the lawsuit, the school districts are really clear. Like, I need money to repair the bathrooms because none of them are working and we don't have the money to do that. I have 35 kids in my class. I can't offer full day K because I can't afford it. These are, impediments, certainly lack of bathrooms, too few teachers, and half day kindergarten are impediments to what we know are in basic needs for kids to learn. So I'm not sure I'm answering your question directly because I'm not sure I thoroughly understood it, but you could tell me, Wade, what I said that wasn't clear to you.
No, that was perfect. This is definitely a educators conference call. So thank you.
That's okay. Good. No problem.
So a reminder that you can click the raise your hand button if you want to ask a question out loud, or you can type your question in the Q&A dialog box.
John, if there's not a question, I want to clarify something. So is there a question?
There is. Yeah. Let's. Maddie, I'm going to click the allow to talk button. You should be unmuted on our end. Go
yes. Ahead. Hi, and thanks for doing this. I'm wondering if you think that the commission needs to address the hold harmless aspect of school funding, and if so, what your expectations are for how they would change that.
I don't think they need to. I mean, there's nothing in law that requires it. There's nothing in the enabling statute of the BEF commission that requires that. And for the benefit of the reporters who are on the call, as I mentioned at the top, we give out most of the money in an old, outdated formula that doesn't have an accurate student count. So we're paying for, the hold harmless is paying school districts for hundreds of thousands of children that are no longer attending them, primarily in Western PA because of depopulation. And it doesn't pay districts on their full amount for the total number of students. So a growing school district is not being paid at the appropriate amount for every student that's there. But you could either talk about reshifting that money from where we're not spending it to where more students are. But remember, a lot of the hold harmless school districts are also very poor, very low wealth communities. They're depopulated for a reason. It's not that they have a strong tax base. And some of them are very low spending districts, not all. Some of them have been getting a lot of funding from the state because they've lost 50% of their kids. So they have double the amount of money to spend per kid because their state money has kept pace with inflation or greater in all these years since 91. So if you were taking money away from hold harmless school districts, you create a political calculus that's very difficult because lawmakers are not going to want to go home and say they cut their school districts. On the other hand, you do free up money. So you could decide that part of the remedy to come up with the state share of the several $1 billion the state will need to ante up to comply with the lawsuit and give our kids the opportunity they deserve could come from redirection of money that's in hold harmless districts. But there's nothing that requires that. And there may be a lot of factors that would make that very complicated.
And I guess I would like to just chime in that the adequacy targets will help determine what anything like that would look like. So there might be a hold harmless district that is getting, quote, more than its, quote, fair share, but in fact, it could still be inadequately funded because the entire system is so grossly underfunded that even districts that are getting more than their fair share still don't have what they need, especially in a lot of these like poor rural districts. You know, they may have lost population, but when they lose population, they also lose tax base. And so they have absolutely no way to raise any more money at the local level. And so I think that the conversation, which we would always talk about, is like the school funding Hunger Games, where we would focus, where some people want to focus on taking money from one district to give to other districts as the solution to the school funding problem. That really isn't a solution. And I think the adequacy targets will help to really flesh out where are there school districts that have adequate funding already, and where are there school districts that don't. And then I think at that point, once you have the adequacy targets, then you could have a conversation about hold harmless. But just randomly saying we're going to start to take money away from districts that seem overfunded is completely counter to what Judge Jubileer ordered, which is making sure that all kids have the resources they need in their classrooms.
Thank you. If I could just ask one
Okay.
quick follow-up question, if I'm not taking away time from others, is just Donna, when you were talking about the previous efforts under Governor Rendell and how the state had come up with I believe you said a 6-year time frame that they were going to phase in money over. I just wanted to make sure I'm correct that essentially was abandoned when the recession hit, or is that kind of what happened there?
It was a confluence of events. The recession hit. We did not abandon the rollout during the recession during the Rendell term. Every year that Rendell was governor, including the 2 years of the recession while he was still the governor, the rollout continued. The rollout stopped when Tom Corbett was elected. And he not only interrupted the rollout, he cut the schools by $1 billion and blacklined the formula. But every year, the rollout continued every year, although in the last 2 years, it was less ambitious than had been originally proposed because state revenues were insufficient to hit that target level.
Okay. And the target was 2.6 billion over
2.6 over 6 years. And that was based on adequacy targets that were determined by the costing out study to say, as Susan said, how much are effective high performing schools spending on their children? And then how do you apply that to schools dependent on their student population? How many kids are poor? How many kids are coming from ESL households? What is their special ed penetration rate? So that you got a higher amount the further away you were and the more needs you had for your students.
Thank you.
Thanks, Maddie. Donna, you were saying before you wanted to clarify something.
I just wanted to make sure everybody understood what we mean by the term adequacy targets. And Susan started on that. And, basically for anybody who's new to this, an adequacy target is how much do you have to spend on the average student that walks in the door. That's determined in there's 3 ways you could determine that. How do highly effective schools, what does their student spending look like for a typical student? Or you could do a budget, zero-based budgeting, costing out study, or you can do an expert opinion study. There are 3 ways. States do this all the time. Pennsylvania did it in 2006. You don't really come out with much difference depending on what methodology. When we did it in Pennsylvania in 06, there was like $300 difference, even though we spent a lot of money for 3 different methodologies. And so if you take the most effective schools and you say, okay, the average student there cost $8,000 a year, $9,000 or $10,000 a year to get production, get good results. Now you have to factor in it's going to cost more for a poor kid, more for if you have a school district. What we found in 2006 is that where a school district has greater than 30% of its kids in poverty, it has sort of a ripple effect on education that requires more investment. And whether you have kids who are coming in that don't speak English, kids coming from the child welfare caseload is another factor. They're kids with greater needs. And so you take that 10,000 and you have a multiplier like our school funding formula does effectively. And you tally up for every school the amount that the average kid and the amount that the kids with more needs need. And that becomes the sum total of the adequacy target for that school district, moderated for the local tax effort. That's your ultimate wonk out there.